the game is, what does your resume look like? Have the resume get the interview, it's the interview, get the internship that leads hopefully to a full-time position. Like it was very clearly marked. This is the road that everybody's going on. You don't know what you really want to do, take that road.
Today, I get to welcome my Amherst classmate, Blake Murphey, a liberal arts kid who took the road that some of us talked about but rarely chose: military service. After early finance internships and a brief postgrad stint abroad, Blake felt the pull towards a different kind of purpose and became a U.S. Navy intelligence officer. His tours took him from an aircraft carrier's intel cell to a SEAL team deployment in East Africa, onto NATO in Italy, the Pentagon, and now working with the explosive ordnance community, aka the folks who defuse bombs. Along the way, he learned to make decisions under pressure, lead teams, and when the amygdala fires, hum Bob Seger's night moves in his head to reset. Yes, really. Today, we trace the messages that we inherited about success, how Amherst socialized us, why Blake left finance for service, what leaving and returning taught him about meaning, and why he treats time, not titles, as the most precious, non-renewable resource. Let's dive in. All right. So, Blake, it is so great to see you. I think it's been, 20 years. It's been half a life ago, something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Although, it also feels kind of like yesterday in some ways when you,
It does. It does. It's so funny how that happens. And it's really funny how we reconnected, because I think I was posting about, we imagine everyone's watching our every step. And I think that
Mhm.
day you messaged me and you're like, I see what you're doing and I love it. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. This guy I haven't talked to from college like 2 decades ago is cheering me on, from the sidelines and connecting. And
Absolutely.
it was like such a gift to me to receive your message and to start to hear about what you've been up to, which I'm really excited and curious about diving into.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it takes bravery, I think, to do what you're doing. Courage for sure to, step outside and do that introspection and then also put it out there, because I think a lot of people certainly have those thoughts and not everybody's willing to act on them or to raise their hand and say, hey, this is the way I feel. So I think so
Mm,
many of us are, just trained to keep pushing ourselves, and we don't always stop and reassess. So I think what you're doing is great.
thank you. So I definitely want to hear what you've been up to these past couple of years, and some of the interesting choices that you've made to really build a career and a life for yourself that is so different from the Amherst College default path, from the
Mhm.
paths that uh, were modeled to us or that we were told that we should aspire to, from starting off in finance and then this major pivot to a career in military service. It's really not a path that many Amherst grads choose. So I want to get into that. But before I do that, I actually want to rewind even earlier. Looking back to your childhood, your early upbringing, what were some of the messages that your family shared with you about work, success, service, like what a good life looks like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think my mom was certainly a workaholic. I grew up in New York City, Manhattan, for the first half of my life, and
Mm.
only child. And so my mom was in the fashion industry. She traveled all across the world, mainly in the Far East. And so she was gone traveling quite a bit when I was younger, but I also have these really vivid memories of waking up in the middle of the night and the lights outside my room were on. And I would walk out and my mom was pulling an all nighter. And we had this massive dining room table. And she had all these different things, paperwork strewn out. And seeing her work like that and, be very, very devoted to her career certainly resonated with me. And my dad was also, he's an entrepreneur, started his own company, clean pipelines, and was building that. And so he was gone during the week, basically from Monday to Thursday for quite a bit. Yeah. So, I would see him on the weekends predominantly. Luckily, we had a nanny. Her name was Dolores, but I call her Da. She was with our
Mm.
family from the time I was about, I think, one, almost, maybe a little bit before, all the way until when I was 10. And so Da really raised me for the most part during the week. And then, at night, I'd come home, or my mom would come home just in time for dinner. And sometimes my dad would be there. Sometimes he wouldn't, but I would see him on the weekends.
So both of your parents were really committed to their
Absolutely.
careers.
Yes. Yeah. They were good parents, I never felt like, and maybe I haven't done enough therapy to like go back and really reassess everything. But I certainly felt loved. And I think Da was a great stand-in. Um, my wife, who had a much more normal upbringing, would tell me that was obviously atypical, and so certainly look back on some of that, left a mark in terms of like, all right, well, obviously career is very important, and being a hard charger, and all in
Mm.
on your career. And even if you have a family, it's still, your career is your, so that was childhood.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever really thought about it. I think it was always just kind of a given. And I
Mm.
think that
Mhm.
I applied that same kind of mindset for, sports. Played sports at Amherst, played football, and then obviously when you can't play sports anymore, that shifts to other aspects of your life. I do struggle with work-life balance and need to be reminded on, hey, take a step back, take a breath, reassess, and prioritize.
Yeah, it's hard. I think so many of us struggle with it, especially when we're taught this is the thing, like this is the purpose of your
Hmm.
life. I was thinking about this the other day that we get this message. It's like we have to make a mark. Like we need the world to know that Allie Canton existed, that Blake Murphy existed. And we often think of that through our careers when there's also these completely mundane ways of like being a good neighbor or being a good friend or just the fact of being like, a stable, well regulated, loving father. Like that
Hmm.
is actually something that is the most mundane thing and the most transformative thing for
Absolutely.
someone's
Yeah.
life. Or even, hearing you talk about Da, right?
Hmm.
People wouldn't necessarily say, oh, she was a nanny, but she played such an important role in your life, right? And like
Absolutely.
offering love and shaping you. So this is something
Hmm.
that I'm starting to like wrestle with of like purpose doesn't have to necessarily be something that is like so big and that is so individualistic. Like it can actually be something that I think is far more subtle and more relational.
Absolutely. I've had similar thoughts. The first one is we have a purpose to leave our mark on the world, and having people remember, Blake Murphy. I think if you look in the history books, there's so many people who've achieved 10 times more than we ever would. And, you memorize their names for a test, and then they fall back into the recesses of your mind to never be remembered again. And so really,
Mm-hmm.
what are the chances that any of us are actually going to achieve anything that's going to be recorded uh, in the archives of time? So I think I'm a little less likely to try to do something like that. I think also, in terms of like influence and leaving that mark, I think you hit the nail on the head with being a good father or just being a good person. I think if you look back at your time in school, grade school, I think you could certainly look at the teachers who
Mm-hmm.
left a mark on you and probably changed the trajectory of your life. And it's like, you want to talk
Yeah.
about impact? That's, what's more impactful than that?
Yes.
Um, and that's certainly something that I think after I'm done with this chapter of my life, teaching is something I love to go do. And for that very reason, to try to help shape and mold the next generation or next few generations. Because ultimately I think that's the real name of the game, is just try to help the younger folks coming up, when you can, and, impart that hard earned knowledge when possible.
No, I think that's beautiful. I do think that there is something, especially for little boys, like
Yeah,
having other men as educators to look up to.
absolutely.
And then I think it's also sort of like maybe fulfilling your Amherst College karma that we all have to get into education or something
Yeah,
at
yeah.
some point. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about Amherst. I can tell you I had some serious shell shock when I first showed up there. Like I was Allie from Jersey with the hooked up Integra. I had rims, tints, my shirt matched my shoes. And I stumbled into this. It was like the most elite, sort of like WASP institution where half the kids came from these elite boarding schools or prep schools, and they had trust funds and family names on buildings and such. I'd be curious, like, how similar or different was that environment, not just from the wealth, but like there definitely is like a culture, I'd say, to Amherst College. How different was that for you? What was it like for you arriving there?
So I will say I came from a boarding school. So I was a little not New England boarding school. It was in Virginia. So I would say
A
that
little bit
we're
different.
different, a little different. Yeah. But I think that the things that probably for me at Amherst were the biggest culture shock was really just the freedom of thought and expression that so many people
Mm,
had, that there was nothing that was ever off the table. Right. And so you have people that had such passions and like completely different beliefs than I had or even been exposed to. And just having that freedom to talk about it and to really investigate it, I thought was one of the greatest things about Amherst, because it was that kind of that safe space, at least in my experience, to really explore. Now that
yes.
everybody take complete advantage of it, I think I certainly was freshman year. I took something involving Buddhism, and I
Mm,
very quickly realized like I'm way ahead over my skis here, and started kind of dialing it back a little bit. But yeah, I think that from that regard, that freedom was really the thing that caught me and was surprised me the most, because I came from such a regimented, structured, and also Southern. It's the oldest boarding school in the South, so there
mm,
were not many people from the Northeast, and especially people on the more liberal side of the spectrum. And so I think that
yeah.
was great for me personally.
Yeah. A different kind of shock for you,
Yes,
I imagine. Yeah.
but a good shock.
And a good one. Yeah.
Hmm.
So who are your role models at Amherst? Like what do you think that you learned there? Who did you look up to and why?
Gavin Weeks is a guy who comes to
Mm,
mind. He was one of the leaders in the football team.
mm-hmm.
He was just such an open and warm guy, and he took everybody under his wing. He was that big brother to most of us. He's one of the many guys who went to Wall Street from the football
Mm-hmm.
team. And freshman Blake is looking at like, all right, what am I going to do? And I've been watching these guys on the football team go to their internships. They would miss practice to go interview in New York, and you'd always hear about who got what or who's doing what. And so that certainly stuck with me. And I very quickly was like, all right, well, how does this work? Clearly if these guys are all doing it, it speaks to them, and maybe it's kind of like the next best thing from playing sports. If this is a competitive environment, train, compete, and obviously make good money, because I knew like
Yeah.
this is the game. The game is, what does your resume look like? Have the resume to get the interview, ace the interview, and then get the internship that leads hopefully to a full-time position. Like, it was very clearly marked. It was just like, hey, this is the road that everybody's going on. You don't know what you really want to do, take that road.
Mm-hmm. And I think Amherst, when we went, like it was the top liberal arts college at the time. And we understandably felt like the world was our oyster. There's so many things that you can do, whether it's through the alumni network or just like the name brand quality of the school. It was like everything was open. But then somewhere around junior year for me, I think it took me a little bit longer to like get the memo in some ways. I started to realize it was like we had 5 real options. So you went to med school, law school, you went into finance, education. Some people did consulting. It sounded like very quickly were like, all right, I'm going to do the finance thing. There's guys that I really look up to. They're doing that. It seems like an easy enough path to
Hmm.
manage and apply yourself to. And what's sad is that it seems like this this hasn't really changed. So you and I have exchanged some articles from like Fortune and Slate and Mother Jones and Substack about this.
Hmm.
And I just want to put some stats out there. According to this piece in Fortune, in the 1970s, 1 in 20 Harvard grads went into finance or consulting. By the 90s, that was 1 in 4. And last year, half of Harvard grads took jobs in finance, consulting, or big tech, which is just like staggering.
Yeah.
to think that, this really limited group of industries is capturing, you know, such a massive share of the country's top talent. When, to your point earlier around education, it's like we need people in so many different places. There's so many ways to serve. So I guess
Yeah.
I'd just be curious to hear, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think that there is this great sort of funneling of talent? So either speaking from your own experience or just from, what you've observed.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. And uh, I think the answer is different for a lot of different people. I think that Amherst, yes, it was a great liberal arts school. Number one, as you said, I don't know if you remember, I mean, my personal experience, did you see as many people or as many banks really coming and actively recruiting on Amherst's campus? Or is it more just seeing everybody jumping into the finance fray?
All right. So it's funny that you ask that. I don't remember that many banks coming to Amherst's campus, with one big exception, which I think I actually talked about this with Anaya, but like randomly, I think it was freshman year. This is so weird, like telling the story. I just remember getting on a bus full of women to go down to Wall Street, and we had this whole Goldman Sachs funded experience. And then we did like some quick interviews. And then I think many of us got offers. And I ended up getting an offer in human capital management, which is HR. And I was like, this sucks. And I was like, well, I suck at math. It completely makes sense that this is where they would put me. So I didn't end up taking it. But otherwise, like, I don't really remember them on campus, but I do remember that it is where so many of our friends, because also a lot of our friends played sports. So maybe there's like a little bit of a disproportionate representation of athlete to finance pipeline. But do you
Yeah.
remember them coming to recruit?
No, I mean, I remember, I think there was like, a banking night or something, or a small, maybe kind of career fair type deal where a lot of the alums would come back and talk about their experience and then actively, recruit. But I don't remember any kind of real, hey, this is all these different positions that are on Wall Street, or these are the banks, and this is how it works, or having anybody kind of reach out and try to put me on a bus to Wall Street or anything like that. Now, I have read that, especially at the Ivy League schools, and I don't know if I sent you this article, but there's the recent article in the Wall Street Journal about how there are sophomores who are getting random emails from McKinsey and from, banks saying, hey, this is who we are. And they're starting their recruiting even earlier, which is just,
That's wild.
mind boggling. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy. And I think that, and this is why it's kind of hard to kind of really pinpoint as to why, you see Harvard at that 50%. And I think that the banks and the consulting groups, I think they really know how to recruit, and I think they know how to say, hey, this is like, I mean, obviously everybody knows the money now. And I think the money is different in this day and age than it was back in, say, the 70s. I think that bankers were making the same money as doctors, lawyers, or whatever, or even maybe a little less. A buddy of mine from Princeton had a friend who started first year out of Princeton, $600,000 a year.
What?
Yeah.
As like a 21,
Yeah.
22-year-old kid. That is
22-year-old. Yeah.
bananas.
Yeah. $600,000 a year. And it's like, it only takes one story, right? To
Mhm.
something like that. And you're like, oh man, if
Like,
I
I wanna
even
get that kind of money.
exactly. And so I think that especially for the athletes, I think it's much easier to say, this is a challenge. And this is what that type A personality will certainly drive towards. But I'd
Mhm.
be very interested to see the people who are not athletes who still go that route, who came in thinking that they wanted to be a teacher or join, the Peace Corps or something like that, and how they started getting sidetracked towards
Mm.
that, those positions. And I think there's certainly, they know how to recruit. They know the psyche of students who are at those types of schools. They're already type A personalities, right? Because they got into a Harvard. So they're driven. So how do you start to appeal to that drive? How can other nonprofits or other alternatives start to compete with that? And so that's why I remember Teach for America coming to Amherst, because I remember I sat
Yeah.
in on one of the recruiting pitches for Teach for America. And they always became a hard to get spot. That was a coveted spot. And so they solved the problem. that I think a
Mm,
lot of people haven't solved. And I think some people are starting to catch on to that.
yeah. Like, I think that whether you're going in the banking finance world or Teach for America, it's like this allure of some sort of like social status or prestige, right? So if you've gotten into the Amherst or Harvard or whatever, you're like, oh, well, I know how to play a status game. And
Mhm.
like, I want to, to your point, I just want to go keep getting the next and the next and the next. And I think Teach for America, you're right, has cracked that where if you got an offer at Teach for America, like that was such a big deal. But you're right, it'd be interesting. But I don't know. It's like, could smaller nonprofits get that? Like
Exactly.
maybe not. It'll just be these larger organizations who could maybe cultivate that
Yeah.
sense.
The te- I mean, Teach for America did start as a small nonprofit. I think it was a Princeton athlete who started Teach
No
for America.
way. I had no idea.
Yeah, I know.
Huh.
I'm pretty sure she went to Princeton, but I think she was also an athlete, and she cracked the code. One other, I've been a Navy intelligence officer for the last 11 years. You look at the CIA, and it's a lot of Ivy Leagues, and I think that you need to tap into, the people who may not want to go into finance. The CIA certainly has an aspect and allure to it that you just touched on, and I think they obviously have that brand name. And so I would be curious to see the breakdown of other schools and also athletes to non-athletes and
Hmm.
what that breakout is.
We're starting this path when we're 18, 19 years old or really young. And maybe you're like, oh, we'll just do it for a couple of years. For me, this popped up more like in law school. Wasn't planning on interviewing for any big law firm jobs. I was like, no, 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 I'm a public interest person. Like, F that, blah, blah, blah. Uh, and then this was 2009. And I remember people saying to me, don't be a jerk. We're in the middle of like biggest recession. You are so lucky to have the options that you have. At least go interview and at least go see. And I was like, fine, at least I'll go interview. So I go interview and then you collect offers. And once you get an offer, you're like, okay, well, how am I not going to do it? Right. So it just like became
Mhm.
this thing. And then so many people say I'll just go for like 2 or 3 years. I remember I think it was the Slate article. They're like, I'll just get my bag and then I'll get out. And
Yep.
then what I think we see from like a lot of our friends is it's like, okay, you get the bag, but then you start spending from that bag to
Mhm.
sustain a certain
Yep.
lifestyle. I think we're making $160,000 first year out of law school at all these big firms. That's so much money. That's bananas, And now I see my friends and they're making, a couple $1 million a year and they're living in the city and they're like, dude, this is tough. Like, I'm like
Yeah.
scraping to buy.
You look at how cost of living, like our parents, it was so much cheaper,
Hmm.
affordable, right? The American dream to be able to have that, that house with the white picket fence and send your kids to good schools. And now it's like it's unaffordable, unattainable for so many people. And so just as a matter of wanting to give your kids the same opportunities that you had, I feel like a lot of people, almost feel like they're pushed into a corner. And they say, look, I would love to go be a teacher or something like that, but my kids are not going to have the same opportunities. It's
Mm-hmm.
an unfortunate part of reality. I think that people are starting to wisen up and realize that there are so many alternatives out there
Yes.
to, the rat race. And I could see how somebody obviously coming out of college is like, I don't know the first thing about running a business. I'm going to go play it
Yeah.
safe. But it seems like maybe as people start to wisen up and they get older and they look at life differently, they change courses.
Yes. They realize what really matters. Okay. So I know that you had some internships at like Merrill Lynch, Credit Suisse, and then 2 years later, you end up joining the Navy. So tell me, like, how did that happen? What happened?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a great question. I did my internship at Credit Suisse that one summer and kind of had this thought that like, okay, I've done New York, like this is, home for me. I didn't get to go abroad when I was at college. So I really had this desire to go out and see the world and have that experience. I thought maybe I'll go do finance abroad because I still think finance is the name. And then 2008 also happened after that
Mm,
internship. And so that made it that much easier because I even saw friends who, had full-time offers from banks that no longer existed.
Yeah.
and it disappeared. And so I was like, all right, well, now's a really great time to maybe go overseas. I also, military service runs in my family. So funny enough, I'd actually had an offer from West Point in high school, and I was adamantly, I was like, nope, no, thank you. I could not have wanted to do anything like less than the military. And then senior year, I don't know why, but I just went to the military recruiter, the Marine Corps recruiter. But my dad talked me out of doing the Marines. He's like, you're absolutely not going to do the Marine Corps. This is also Afghanistan and Iraq are both going on during this
Mm,
time, so it's not like you're just joining the military. Like you're going to join the military and you're going to go deploy at least once to a war zone. And so he was just kind of like, you're taking time. Let's look at other paths. And then sure enough, through an Amherst alum, was able to finagle something in London. And I was like, oh, all right, I'm doing finance and I'm living abroad. I had my, what I call my quarter life crisis. And I was like, this is not what I want to do. I need to do something completely different. And a good friend of mine went to Princeton and joined the Navy, applied and got in to be a surface warfare officer. So guys drive the ships. And so
wow.
when he took that job, I was like, all right, I'm gonna go back and look at this again. And that's when I decided, I'm like, all right, I want to do the military.
What was your experience in the Navy? Like, what did you learn about yourself through the Navy?
Lots of things.
What did you learn? Yeah, through 13 years. No big deal. What did you learn?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that your ability to handle stress certainly comes out, and seeing how, sleep deprivation and different situations can impact you. And you sometimes, until you're actually put in that pressure cooker, you don't know how you really respond to that level of stress. And so learning how to cope with that and manage it and, push on. I think that was one of the big things that, as part of the military indoctrination, that they really drive into you, and also want to make sure that you're ready to go. And as an officer, you're expected to lead from day one
Mm,
after CS. And so that was one of the important things that, I think I learned about myself, and also through the military. And then really just, I think Amherst was a great influence on me, because I think that I don't remember anything I learned at Amherst other than how to learn and the curiosity that Amherst instills in you. Right. And so you learn how to be inquisitive and to ask questions and to read and research and everything else. And that's really what being an intel officer is doing those deep dives on, an enemy group or a hostile country or XYZ. And so those fundamentals that Amherst gave me really translated well in the Navy. So my first tour was on an aircraft carrier. I was part of the intel cell on the carrier that essentially monitored all of the area surrounding the carrier and the strike group. And so, like, if we were in the Persian Gulf, monitoring the many threats that were surrounding the carrier, at any time, someone could just launch a missile, or had some fighter planes overhead or whatever else, and monitoring that and relaying it to the necessary people to be able to protect the carrier strike group is what your job was. And that was as an ensign. So some of my colleagues were 22 years old and responsible, and essentially briefing the admiral. I'm like, hey, sir, this is what's going on. I think we should launch these two F-18s just in case, to, protect the strike group.
wow.
So that, that level of responsibility was huge, and was awesome, especially for someone, as young as I was. And then followed that up with SEAL Team 10. So it was a N2 Alpha. So I was basically like the head, and then also the assistant for intel for one of the SEAL
Wow.
teams. Deployed to East Africa, spent 6 months in the embassy in Nairobi, was exposed to a ton of different agencies, a ton of different groups, worked closely with some partner forces. And that was hands down like the coolest thing ever. It's exactly what I joined up to do. Went from there, worked for NATO, lived in Sicily, lived on Mount Etna, which is awesome.
That's
Did
so
that for
cool.
2 years. Yeah, so it was great. And that was one of the reasons also to join the Navy, see the world. Because I
Hmm.
did love that travel aspect. And then worked in the Pentagon for 2 years, and then went back to NSW. And now I'm with EOD Group 2, which are the guys that defuse bombs for a living. Yeah. So IEDs, all those types of devices. We're not at war anymore, so they're not doing that actively. But during Afghanistan and Iraq, they were always out on deployment or on deployment and on patrol, you know, defusing bombs. And so those are the guys who I'm working with right now.
That's incredible. So, something that I'd be curious to hear about both through your work now, diffusing bombs, but then also like in the intelligence role. So, I'd imagine that there can be a couple of things that develop. Like, I can imagine some people become like hyper vigilant because that's your job is like to constantly be monitoring. And then I imagine maybe sort of like conversely or inversely, you probably also become really good at discerning the signal from the noise because there is just so much going on. I'd be curious to hear like what are some techniques or some ways that you helped keep yourself, like how do you keep your mind right in that environment? Because I can just imagine that there's so much again coming in. That's like what I get the image of. There's so much coming in and like
Yeah.
you need to be laser focused and you need to be on, and that admiral, right, is like trusting your judgment about when you're making a recommendation to deploy certain resources to certain places.
No, no, it's a good question. So I think the first and easy answer is that always work with such great people. And so as an officer, I'm running essentially a team or a cell of intel analysts. And so each analyst will provide a little piece of the puzzle. And then it's my job to take those pieces, put them together, see the big picture, and then brief that big picture to the people who are the decision makers, the operators, or whatever, to then go and do what they need to do. And so I think from, yes, there is a lot of information that's getting thrown to you, but you also have really good filters, right? Because it's their job
Mm-hmm.
to pick out what's important out of the noise and relay that to me to then overlay that with what everybody else is seeing. I will say that there's certain environments where it's a lot more fluid and, you don't have that luxury of time. And there is certainly, that's where, again, like going back to some of that just conditioning of dealing with stress, and, breath work. Like I love that we were doing breath work before this.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important in knowing when you start to get a little bit of the fight or flight mode, you just get overwhelmed. One of the great things about with the community I'm working with right now is that they've got sports psychologists and performance coaches there. You get completely overwhelmed in a very, very high stress environment. And my brain will go blank a little bit when I have to try to walk through it and get it going again. Like the amygdala is just completely taken over. And she suggested take one of the songs that you love from, growing up or whatever right now that's soothing to you and just sing it in your head
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and use that to kind of like get things going again, And so I put a song that my dad and I used to listen to in the car, which is called Night Moves from Bob Seger. Yeah. I start singing that in my head. And that's the thing I just go to if I ever get to like that absolute point where I'm just like, what's my first move? And that's helped.
That's really good advice. I love the idea of bringing in both song and memory because I imagine that combination actually it's
Hmm.
moving you to a completely different part of your brain. So, like, I know that we're close to the end of our time, but before we close, I'd love to hear what advice would you give to someone, say, whether it's one of our classmates or even, I don't know, mentoring your Amherst age self.
Hmm.
What advice would you give someone who's looking to step into a life of deeper purpose?
Yes. All right. That's always the great question. I think that looking at time as the most valued commodity, right? It's a non-renewable commodity. And so looking at time as that most precious, more than money than anything else, and making sure that you prioritize that and everything else will kind of work itself out. I think that if you do the things that you really want to do, and pursue those passions because you don't know what the next 5 years are going to be like. And this is, I know, speak from this personally. Like I thought everything was under control and got through a curveball, and my son had some health issues, and the it's one of those, he's good now, but it's just one of those things that it's like, what you want to do it now, because you don't really know what life is going to look like down the road, and if you just keep kicking that can down the road and you just keep saying, hey, I'm just going to take this job for right now and I'll figure it out later. I may not be it later. I know it sounds like morbid, but you also just never know what's going to happen. And I think that, especially with Amherst for students, everybody's smart, right? And so if money is the problem, that you're always thinking like, all right, I'm just taking this for the money, but you go and you do other jobs or other areas that you're passionate about, there's money will follow, right?
Yes.
I mean, anything you can do, if you're passionate and you become an expert, money will follow regardless. And even just objectively speaking, like if you are smart, you're going to go play in an arena with people who are smarter than you or as smart, the competition is going to be stiff. If you went to another area that you not only enjoy, but you're also going to be the big fish in the small pond, it's not a bad way of looking at things, because you can be uber successful in a different field, one that you like, and
Yeah.
also lucrative. So I just think that analyzing all options, not taking anything off the table, and talking to people who are older than yourself and hearing their experiences, like I think you and I both did. I think it's important.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And whenever you talk to those older people, I think I told this story in another episode of the podcast, but it sticks with me. There was an older woman that I worked with maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, because I was pregnant with my son. And she was in her late 50s. And I remember I just like didn't like this woman. I just like didn't like her. And at my baby shower at work, I remember she said, she's like, "You're a brilliant lawyer. You're incredible. You're amazing. But we can do your job here and no one can do your job at home." And at the time, it was so funny. At the time, I was like, "Oh, fuck her. Like, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Like, I can't believe this is the advice she's giving me on my baby shower. Like, how dare she?" And now, as a mother with like years, I'm like, she was absolutely 100% right. Like, those older people will never say to us, spend less time with your family, spend less time with your community, spend less time focused on your health. But those are the things that we're making the trade-offs of, usually when we're choosing the big job or the lot of money, or indexing only on the money versus, to your point, indexing on the passion, trusting that passion is magnetic, and money is one of the things that will be attracted to that passion.
Yes, absolutely. And the truth always cuts like a knife, I mean, that,
Oof. Mhm.
yeah, went right down. So I think that those are obviously very wise words, but I'm glad to see that you took them to heart and continue to build on that. And hopefully your courage continues to, spread. At the end of the day, I think it is a little bit of courage, maybe a little bit of stupidity, a little craziness. But I'm still happy, and I would do this. I'd make the same decisions again if I could. So I regret none of it.
Well, Blake, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so, so much for coming on. I'm so happy that the universe, the algorithm, reconnected us so that we could
Absolutely.
have this conversation and to share your amazing story.